From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!'s special broadcast expanding the debate.
Maybe he doesn't want the American people, all of you watching tonight, to know that he's paid nothing in federal taxes, because the only years that anybody's ever seen were a couple of years when he had to turn them over to state authorities when he was trying to get a casino license, and they showed he didn't pay any federal income tax. So if he's paid zero, that means zero for troops, zero for vets, zero for schools or health.
A week after Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton faced off in their first debate, their running mates, Indiana Governor Mike Pence and Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, debate tonight in Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia.
To me, it just seems like our nation, it is just too great to put it in the hands of a slick-talking, empty-promising, self-promoting, one-man wrecking crew.
For the sake of the rule of law, for the sake of the sanctity of life, for the sake of our Second Amendment, and for the sake of all our other God-given liberties, we must ensure that the next president appointing justices to the Supreme Court is Donald Trump.
We'll air tonight's debate and expand the debate by giving Green Party vice presidential candidate Ajamu Baraka, who is barred from participating, a chance to respond to the same questions in real time posed to Pence and Kaine. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
In just under an hour, vice presidential candidates Republican Mike Pence and Democrat Tim Kaine face off in Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia, in their first and only debate before next month's election. But third-party candidates, including Libertarian William Weld and the Green Party's Ajamu Baraka, were excluded from the debate stage under stringent rules set by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is controlled by the Democratic and Republican parties.
Tonight, we will air the vice presidential debate live, and we will expand the debate by giving a major third-party candidate a chance to respond to the same questions in real time. The Green Party's Ajamu Baraka will join us live for the full debate. Libertarian vice presidential candidate William Weld did not respond to our offer. In the lead-up to the debate, we'll host a roundtable discussion leading up to the start of the vice presidential debate, looking at the records of Tim Kaine and Mike Pence and the state of the presidential race. But first, a bit of biographical background for the two major party vice presidential candidates.
Democrat Tim Kaine is the junior senator from Virginia and Virginia's former governor. His selection as vice president was criticized by many progressives. Until recently, Kaine supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He was one of 13 Democratic senators to vote to give President Obama power to fast-track the TPP through Congress. He's been criticized by unions for his support of so-called right-to-work laws. He's also been seen as a friend of Wall Street who's advocated for loosening bank regulations. On foreign policy, he's backed a no-fly zone in Syria. On social issues, Kaine has said he is personally opposed to abortion, but Planned Parenthood has given him a perfect score for his voting record.
Mike Pence is the governor of Indiana. In 2015, he made national headlines when he signed into law the highly controversial Anti-LGBTQ Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which gave businesses license to discriminate. Dozens of companies, professional sports teams and leagues, including the Indianapolis-headquartered NCAA, threatened to boycott Indiana. Ultimately, Governor Mike Pence was forced to enact a revision specifying the law does not authorize anti-LGBT discrimination. As governor, Pence also oversaw a cut in Planned Parenthood funding in Indiana and signed legislation which has since been blocked that would have restricted abortion access statewide. In 2011, as a Congress member, Pence threatened to shut down the entire government if Congress did not defund Planned Parenthood.
Well, to talk about these issues and more, we'll spend the rest of the hour with a number of guests. Fang and Zaid Jilani are journalists with The Intercept. Chase Strangio is a staff attorney with the ACLU's LGBT and AIDS Project. Catherine Franke is director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University and the board chair of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Naila Avan is a civil and human rights lawyer at Demos, and Andrew Basevich is retired colonel and Vietnam War veteran. His latest book is titled America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. His previous books include Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War.
We begin with two reporters at The Intercept. Zaid Jilani is in Washington, D.C., and Fang is in San Francisco. Lee's most recent piece is headlined, Big Business Declares TPP the Winner in Vice Presidential Debate. Lee, let's go there first. Talk about why you see big business as the winner even before the debate begins.
Amy, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here. Earlier today, in the run-up to the debate tonight, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the largest big business lobbying group in America, this is a trade group that represents big companies like ExxonMobil and Dow Chemical, they pronounced the true winner of the debate, which is free trade. These big trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership back to NAFTA, all of these controversial trade deals over the last 2 decades have been pretty much supported by both running mates, Mike Pence and Tim Kaine. Now, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of populist rhetoric. We've seen Donald Trump centering his economic policy in opposition to these trade deals. Hillary Clinton, under intense political pressure from Bernie Sanders, reversing her support from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a deal that she helped negotiate. But for the running mates, it's a completely different story. Mike Pence, when he was in Congress, voted for every single free trade deal before him. He also supports the TPP. Tim Kaine was one of a small group of Democratic senators who supported Fast Track last year, that legislation that lays the groundwork for President Obama to move ahead with the TPP. Now, Kaine has reversed his position when he joined the Clinton campaign ticket this summer, saying that he now has reservations about the TPP, but the Chamber of Commerce seems very confident that Kaine is simply playing politics and that once elected, he will move back into supporting the TPP.
Well, let's go to Zaid Jilani now in Washington, D.C. Zaid, can you tell us a little bit more about Tim Kaine and his positions on issues like climate change and others, and how much that accords with the Democratic Party?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. I love Democracy Now!, and it's a great resource, I think, for people all over the country. With respect to Kaine, I actually had a chance to talk to him 2 days before he was picked to join the Democratic ticket. And one of the first things I asked him about was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And even that, that day, 2 days before he joined the ticket, he praised the agreement. He praised the intellectual property provisions in particular, and he stood by his vote to help fast-track the agreement, which will make it much easier to pass. At the DNC, I also happened to speak to some energy lobbyists from the American Petroleum Institute, which is one of the main oil folks out on Capitol Hill, and they told me that he was the best they could hope for. Kaine, I think, in many ways is an ethical man. Look, I think he had a history of working for civil rights as a defense attorney, as a civil rights attorney, but I think ultimately he's a Democratic politician who looks for consensus. And I think a lot of the consensus in Washington, unfortunately, centers around corporations, around, let's say, expanding access for oil drilling, around passing agreements like the TPP. Kaine has spoken a lot about how he worked with sort of Catholic missionaries in Latin America, and yet when he was governor, he was an advocate for the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that rewarded the country where the largest number of trade unionists are killed every single year. So I think that, Kaine, has a history that in some ways I think we can be proud of in terms of some of his accomplishments, but I think at the same time he's often reached over to the other side of the aisle to corporate interests that just are opposed to what the public wants. And I think by picking him, Clinton did signal that she isn't going to be very tough on these issues, regardless of what she says during this campaign.
The Republican National Committee released an ad yesterday attacking Tim Kaine's record as a public defender.
When you want to know something about the character of somebody in public life, look to see if they have a passion that began long before they were in office, and that they have consistently held it throughout their career.
Long before Tim Kaine was in office, he consistently protected the worst kinds of people. Lem Tuggle raped, sodomized, and murdered Jesse Geneva Havens after being paroled for murdering a 17-year-old girl. Tim Kaine defended him. Richard Lee Whitley sexually assaulted and murdered his elderly neighbor. Tim Kaine defended him. Outside Whitley's execution, Tim Kaine said, "Something personal in me will die with Whitley." Percy Walton brutally murdered 3 people. As governor, Tim Kaine commuted his sentence, citing concerns disproved by the courts. Jens Soring and his girlfriend murdered Derek and Nancy Haysom, stabbing them to death in their home. On his last day as governor, Tim Kaine tried to have Soring sent to Germany, where parole would have been possible in just 2 years. Tim Kaine. He has a passion for defending the wrong people. America deserves better.
So that is the ad against Tim Kaine. Zaid Jilani, you've written all about this. Can you talk about this case?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, this ad, I think, is a throwback from the GOP to where Americans were just terrified of crime when they wanted to see harsher punishments and harsher brutality by the state, regardless of whether it actually does offer a humane and sort of lasting rehabilitation to the victims of crime. One of the cases mentioned in this ad with Percy Walton was an individual who was given a state psychiatric evaluation. He told his relatives he was Jesus. He had an IQ of, I think, 66. He was declared very heavily mentally incompetent and schizophrenic, and therefore Tim Kaine basically commuted his sentence to life without parole. And I think, you know, that ad on the one hand is very horrible. It sort of creates a case where we should be, they're basically advocating for executing the mentally ill, which is just an atrocious thing to begin with. But I think the other interesting thing here is that Kaine himself is far from an abolitionist. Just as he has personal Catholic, sort of Catholic-inspired opposition to abortion, he has similar opposition to the death penalty. Yet he didn't really act on those principles when he was governor. He oversaw 11 sort of capital punishment cases, and I believe this was the only one that he ended up commuting. So I think actually it's an interesting case where Republicans are attacking Democrats for being too soft or too left-wing, when the reality is the Democrat they are attacking was not at all left-wing on this issue, despite his own personal convictions on it. And unfortunately, I think that this sort of politics is what ends up boxing people in, and often politicians give into it. But, you know, it's interesting to note that right now Americans are actually seeing a surge in opposition to the death penalty. A majority of self-declared Democrats oppose the death penalty. And I think it's time for politicians to start getting on the right side of this issue and stop being one of the only countries left in the world, particularly only developed countries, that utilizes this practice, which honestly does not bring any justice to the victims and needlessly takes human lives.
And Lee Fang, could you talk a little bit more about Mike Pence, his ties to the Koch brothers, why you think Trump chose him, and why some expressed happiness? I mean, in other words, thought that Trump's chances were greatly enhanced by his choice.
Yeah, sure. You know, I just want to underscore something that Zaid just said, because it's very similar to the dynamic that we see with Mike Pence. Just as Hillary Clinton wanted to reassure the lobbyists and big business community in D.C. with the selection of Tim Kaine, who's very close to the donor community, especially through his time as chairman of the DNC. He got close to many of the big donors in America. Mike Pence has been a very, very close confidant of some of the largest donors that have been close to the Republican Party. Well before the Koch brothers became a household name in 2009 and 2010, Mike Pence had been donating with them, or had been, attending their donor meetings. They held twice annual secretive events where they bring together Republican billionaires and multimillionaires to fund the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Mike Pence has been a big player in those meetings going very far back, and he's also been close to the Republican K Street community, to the large lobbying institutions and lobbying firms in D.C. when he was a member of the House. And when he moved on and became the governor of Indiana, he also helped spearhead big money fundraising efforts for the Republican Governors Association. So Mike Pence has a finger in the religious right, which is well documented, but he also has his finger on the pulse of the donor community. And so many think that Donald Trump selecting Mike Pence was a smoke signal to the Republican establishment, reminding them that he's on their side.
And so what are the key things on which they disagree, Trump and Pence?
Well, I mean, there are the main issue where they disagree, where you see the most friction is, of course, trade. Mike Pence not only, as I mentioned, voted for every trade agreement before him in Congress, but he also praised NAFTA, which came before his time in Congress. So I would say that is the largest area of disagreement. But, you know, for other areas, it's tough to say because Donald Trump has been all over the map. Mike Pence, for example, has opposed women in the military. He's criticized HIV/AIDS funding, Planned Parenthood funding. He's, you know, been a very far-right voice on abortion rights. Donald Trump has been all over the map on those issues. And depending on the day, he's been in lockstep agreement with Mike Pence, but on other days, he's in complete disagreement because he's supported in favor, or he's voiced in favor of these issues.
And Zaid Jilani, the difference between Pence and Trump on the issue of war. I mean, Congressman Pence, before he was governor, not only supported the Iraq War, but was a co-sponsor of the Iraq War resolution. How do they work this out?
Well, I think also another thing to add about Pence is that when the war was actually taking place, at some point many people had turned against it, and he actually showed up in a market, I believe in a suburb of Baghdad, and he said something like, "Oh, this is safer than, this is just like a market back home," or something like that. And there had been a bombing there, you know, some weeks prior. So Pence actually dug in very, very harshly into supporting the war. And in terms of how he clashes with Trump, I mean, I think a big part of it is just that Donald Trump picked someone that was basically in the conventional Republican mold. And Trump obviously, you know, isn't in many ways, including with the Iraq War, where he did make some sort of offhanded remarks saying that he was okay with the war when it began, but he's very quickly turned against it within a matter of a few months. And he spent a lot of the primary actually excoriating George W. Bush and basically the war doctrine that he pursued. And then I think, you know, a big part of what Mike Pence's role is to do is to assure traditional Republicans that, hey, if you are a traditional conservative, if you're a Republican, if you don't like social liberalism like Trump does, or if you like war like, you know, Trump says he doesn't like, you can still vote for us because we have Pence on the ticket. And I think, you know, just as Lee said, I think that's what they're trying to do, is at least what the RNC is trying to do. I think that Trump, you know, goes off and riffs on whatever he wants to every day. His strategy is basically a joyride. But I think what Pence says is very well scripted by the RNC, by the consultant class, and by lobbyists. And I think, you know, that's the good cop, bad cop routine that they have with the Republican base right now.
Well, Lee Fang, I want to ask you about the significance of the vice presidential debate generally. You mentioned earlier that 40% of Americans in a recent poll couldn't name either of the two major vice presidential candidates. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. CBS News had a poll out this morning showing that more than 40% couldn't name either running mate. And so I think the problem here will be twofold. One, that simply put, this debate will be an echo chamber for each candidate to basically regurgitate kind of attack lines on the top of the ticket. So, you know, Pence attacking Clinton and Kaine attacking Trump, and making it very personal. And the other issue is that because there's so little scrutiny on the backgrounds of either candidate, because the press and the public hasn't given them much attention, that leaves even less time for a focus on the issues. Just like the first presidential debate, where we didn't see a really kind of detailed discussion of many of the pressing policy issues before voters and before Congress, from privacy to student debt to climate change. We won't really see that in the debate tonight, just because the incentives are so high for both candidates to just try to throw out some attack lines that will be picked up by the media and repeated tomorrow morning.
We're talking to Lee Fang of The Intercept, as well as Zaid Jilani of The Intercept, two reporters speaking to us from San Francisco and Washington. And we're going to be